right, thank you for the song this morning. We will be going to Exodus chapter 24. We're continuing our series through the book of Exodus. So this is message number 31, entitled Sprinkling of Blood. And we're going to be looking at chapter 24, and I'm going to read the first 4 verses to get us started. And he said unto Moses, Come up unto the Lord, thou and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship ye afar off. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come nigh, neither shall the people go up with him. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, All the words which the Lord hath said will we do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and rose up early in the morning, and builded an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So chapter 23 ended the judgments of the law that began in chapter 21. And these judgments revealed certainly the values of the law, and we talked about that as we looked at some of those things. There was certainly a value of life, a value of family. There was a consistent concern for true equality of justice, and a very strong current of responsibility and restitution. That one of the overwhelming messages that comes out of the Old Covenant law is that it's not enough to simply not hurt anyone else, not harm them in some way, or defraud them, or whatever the case may be, but actually the law commanded positive good to be done as well, even to helping your adversary, your enemy, with his animals and things like that. Well, chapter 23, this sort of winds up with these directions for worship, for the calendar of Israel, for these feasts, and also an extensive description of the promise to bring them to the land, reminding us about God's covenant with Abraham and why it was that God did what he did. Again, why did he come to this people? Why did he deliver them from Egypt? Why did he take up their cause with Pharaoh and those of Egypt, and so on? And so reminding us again of those reasons. Well, chapter 24 is the last of this section that we've been in, that began back in chapter 15 and verse 22, which is primarily with the giving of the covenant at Sinai. And here in this chapter, we see the covenant being ratified, we could say. And there's a scene here, and this sort of transitions us to the second half of the book that deals almost entirely with the tabernacle and things pertaining to it. So looking forward from chapter 24, in the rest of Exodus, beginning there with chapter 25, you have Moses on the mountain. He receives instructions primarily, again, pertaining to the tabernacle. Then you have the golden calf incident, and then the remainder of the book is the actual construction of the tabernacle. In other words, that's the main content of what takes it up. So this scene that we get in chapter 24, again, one of the most unique scenes in the Bible, and it's where Moses and the elders of Israel went up the mountain, and they saw God, and they ate a meal. So we're going to look at this chapter in verses 1 to 11. We see the feast on the mountain, and in verses 12 to 18, we actually get a little bit different perspective. We're going to see there what Israel saw. They weren't up on the mountain with Moses and the others, and so they didn't see what they saw, but we're going to see what Israel saw in the last part of the chapter. So we'll begin here. Let's look at verses 1 and 2 again. And he said unto Moses, Come up unto the Lord, thou and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship ye afar off. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come nigh, neither shall the people go up with them. Now, later in Exodus in chapter 33, later in places in the Pentateuch, like Numbers chapter 12, verse number 8, Deuteronomy chapter 34, and verse number 10. It's very clearly stated that Moses wasn't like the other prophets. The way that God dealt with Moses, the way that God spoke to him, it's described as being face to face, as it were, like a man that would speak with another man. But we're also told in some of these, as you go on through the Pentateuch, that with Moses, God didn't speak in visions. He didn't speak in dreams. He didn't speak in riddles. He didn't speak in parables. He did not give Moses dark sayings. Everything that God said to Moses was very plain and direct. And again, as it were, face to face, like a man talking to another man. Now, this obviously is one of the reasons that Exodus is such a unique book. And this chapter obviously contributes to that as we get an extremely rare scene on the mountains. But from the very beginning here, even in verse 1, and he said unto Moses, we are just reminded that God has got an ongoing conversation going with Moses. Now, that's going to continue throughout the rest of the Pentateuch. But in terms of the scope and the scale and all the different things that happen in Exodus, it still stands unique. But God is continuing to speak to Moses. And so some of the people of Israel were to come up to the mountain. Now, if you remember back to chapter 19, the people were warned that they were not to come up to the mountain. They weren't to touch the mountain. In fact, they were to set up boundaries, and they weren't to cross those boundaries, neither man or beast, as it were. Now, Moses and Aaron, along with two of Aaron's sons, were to come up the mountain with 70 elders of Israel. Now, this is the first time that 70 elders of Israel are mentioned. And we're not given a lot of backstory concerning these 70 elders, but most likely these were tribal leaders and sort of lesser judges that were set up after Jethro's advice back in chapter number 18. And of course, we know that this development of the 70 elders of Israel later led to the Sanhedrin Council, and so on. And so it seems here, if we're thinking about this, Moses is going up the mountain, and Moses is God's prophet. And again, very unique among the prophets, but Moses is God's prophet. And then we have Aaron and his sons that would seem that they are representing the priesthood of Israel going up the mountain. And then the 70 elders of Israel that would represent the nation, the tribes, and so on. So in other words, it's not just that Moses and those with him won some sort of prize or they're getting some sort of special treat, but there's very good reason why these particular ones would be chosen, would be to go up there, because again, this is the ratifying of the covenant. But again, Moses was God's chosen prophet, and only he would come near to the Lord, as is described later. Verses 3 and 4. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord hath said will we do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord and rose up early in the morning and builded an altar under the hill and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So Moses, in turn, as we have seen him doing repeatedly, delivers God's words to the nation of Israel at the bottom of the Mount Sinai. And specifically, he mentions that Moses told them all the words and all the judgments. And this particularly refers to the 10 words of the 10 commandments and the judgments or the case laws that followed. And if you remember the terms of the covenant back in chapter 19 and verse 5, when this old covenant with Israel was actually introduced as a covenant, they were to obey God's voice and keep his covenant. And again, that was that was stated before there were many other issues of commands and statutes and all of these other things. Simply, these are the terms. You're going to enter into my covenant, then you're going to have to obey all of my words, whatever those words are, all of my words. And of course, they agreed to do so. Now, oftentimes when we are thinking and speaking about the law, it seems that we sort of make the law and the covenant to be two separate things, but they are not. The law is the covenant. They're not two separate things. And I don't know. I could speculate maybe about the reason behind why some would prefer that sort of a distinction. But nevertheless, we can see it very plainly here and back again in the terms of the covenant as set forth in chapter 19 and verse number 5. They are the same. This is the covenant. This is the law. They are the same thing. Now, once again, Israel as a nation has essentially made an oath to obey God's words. They are committing to obey God's words. Yes, all the words that he speaks, we will do. They said that back in chapter 19. They're saying it again here. They'll say it again as we go forward. Now, we're told that Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. Moses wrote all of these things down. This was a part of his role as a prophet, obviously, receiving revelation from God, communicating that to the people, and not only just speaking that to the people of Israel, but writing it down for them as to be remembered. These are the words of God. So we can see that there's some sort of formality in this proceeding. As you read this chapter, there's some formality of process, almost ceremony, as it were. And sometimes people even refer to this as a covenant ceremony. The Bible doesn't say that, but it certainly does have some ceremonial effects with it. Oh, thank you. So we are told how that Moses built an altar and 12 pillars. Now, we already seen the instruction about the altar, that it was to be of just natural stones. They weren't to be manufactured in any way. There wasn't to be a tool put upon them, but they were essentially stacked up. And it really is what these pillars would be as well. We're not entirely sure. The word itself can be used to describe the various things, just any sort of thing that's sort of set upright. But most likely these would have just been stacked stones, much like the altar itself. And this whole process signified, as the 12 pillars represent the 12 tribes of Israel, we're told, the entering into covenant with Yahweh. And it reminds us somewhat of that, the pieces, the parting of the pieces and such that Abraham went through at that point of the covenant back in Genesis that we studied some time ago. Now, verses 5 to 8. And he sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. Now, these young men are not clearly identified, but it seems that these would have been firstborn sons of the various tribes and functioning in a role that later, as they go on, as things more develop, this was actually a role given to the Levites. But these would be the firstborn sons acting in this role. Moses took the blood of the sacrifice, we're told, the sacrifices, and he divided it into two. And with one half, he used it to sprinkle upon the altar. And the other half, he used to sprinkle upon the people of Israel. Now, we're not told here any particular significance of this sprinkling of the blood, even though we saw something similar with the Passover lamb and such back in Egypt, and the putting of the blood on the doorposts and lintel. But the writer of Hebrews does speak of the significance of this sprinkling of blood. Here, this is Hebrews chapter 9, verses 19 to 22. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, He took the blood of calves and of goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book and all the people, saying, This is the blood of the testament which God hath enjoined unto you. And moreover, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry, and almost all things by the law are purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission. So obviously he's talking about things as they go on. Moses doesn't here sprinkle the tabernacle; it hadn't even been built yet, but that does take place later, and so he's sort of summarizing that and condensing that together. But the significance of it is seen. Almost all things are by the law purged or cleansed with blood or consecrated, and without shedding of blood is no remission. In other words, the sprinkling of blood points to atonement, to redemptive cleansing, but ultimately not atonement with the blood of bulls and of goats, but with atonement by the blood of God's own spotless Lamb, Jesus Christ. And that's the point of what the writer of Hebrews is getting at, how the sprinkling of the new covenant is superior, better than the sprinkling of the old covenant that they experienced here even at Sinai and forward. Now, the book of the covenant that is mentioned here specifically refers to the 10 words and the judgments. And so we could say probably beginning somewhere in what we have as chapter 19 through chapter 23 would specifically be referred to as that book of the covenant that was present then. And again, the people of Israel as a nation, as a people group, they commit to the covenant to obey God's words, and their oath is sealed with the blood of the covenant, and they are sprinkled. Now look at the rest of this part in verses 9 to 11. Then went up Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of a sapphire stone, and as it were the body of heaven in his clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Also they saw God and did eat and drink. So Moses, Aaron, his sons, two of his sons, and the 70 elders went up the mountain. They left the nation at the bottom. They went up the mountain. And they went up there to eat and to drink before the Lord. Now, when you think about it, we're really not given a lot of description about this scene. We're told that they saw God, but what exactly that means and what exactly they saw, we're not really told. The mention of feet, but his feet stood upon this pavement of blue that we'll look at more in a moment, shows us that God, spoken of here on the mountain, was in a human form. Not human, not man, but in a human form. Now, this is also confirmed later in places like Numbers chapter 12 and verse number 8 that speaks of Moses seeing the form of God. Not seeing the very face of God, as it were, but the form of God. So I believe that we can take it from here and from other places in the Pentateuch particularly. They didn't see God's face, but they saw God in a human form. And what did they see? Well, what they saw was they saw Christ in his kingdom glory. That's what they saw, just like Isaiah saw that in Isaiah chapter number 6. Ezekiel saw that in Ezekiel chapter number 1. Daniel saw that in Daniel chapter number 7. And later, 3 of the apostles saw that on the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew chapter number 17. Of course, one great difference there with the Transfiguration is the fact that Jesus was human when he was there on the Mount, because he had at that point taken a human body. And so it wasn't just the form of a human that they saw, but Jesus was man, and they saw him as God as well there on the Mount of Transfiguration. So again, when we put these things together, and each of these different sites had a little bit of different specifics that may be mentioned with them, But nevertheless, we can certainly see the commonality between them. And we put that together with the latter part of the chapter that really removes all doubt about what they saw. And as far as what they saw, that is probably about as specific as we're going to be able to get it if we're going to stick with what the Bible actually says. But it does say that his feet was standing upon this pavement, and it appeared as an opaque blue, and it mentions sapphire. That's really not what we think of as and know of as sapphire today. It is a different type of stone, and I don't recall the name of it right off the top of my head, but I have heard of it before. But it's an opaque blue, sort of has flecks of gold perhaps in it, and it gave the appearance of Christ as he was standing on the very heavens. That the very heavens are under his feet, highly suggestive, obviously, of his rule as Lord of heaven and earth. Now, the eating and drinking that takes place here foreshadows the kingdom feast in the glorious presence of Christ, referred to by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 25, verses 6 to 8. And even Jesus referred to this in Matthew chapter number 8 and verse number 11. And so this certainly looks forward to that as well. But there's also a note here in this passage that Moses and these others that were with him, they saw God, and we're told that twice. They saw God, and he didn't lay a hand on them. Little note that's added there. He didn't lay a hand on them. Basically, what this means is that they saw God and didn't die. And that's exceptional. That's extraordinary. That's why attention is being brought to it. The significance is then we can see they had been sprinkled with the blood, and they came into his presence and they were covered, and so they did not die. Now, much like the blood of the Passover lamb that had preserved them from the angel of destruction, they were covered with that blood, and the firstborn was delivered, did not die. And so that is what we see here on the mountain as well. Now that we get the rest of this chapter, beginning here with verse number 12, and again, we're going to get a different view of what was going on. And what was it that Israel saw when they're at the base of this mountain? They're not up there with the others seeing God and eating. What did they see? We'll begin here with verse number 12. And the Lord said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount and be there, and I will give thee tables of stone and a law and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. So Moses was called to come further up on the mountain, and there he was going to receive the tables of stone. And of course, we know even in the next chapter, these tables of stone that were to be placed in the ark. And by them, the law was to be taught to Israel. Now, these tables of stone are also referred to as the tables of testimony in chapter 31 and verse number 18. In Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 9, they're referred to as the tables of the covenant. And so this is what Moses was going to receive when it was time for him to go up. Verses 13 and 14. And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua, and Moses went up into the mount of God. And he said unto the elders, tarry ye here for us until we come again unto you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man have any matters to do, let him come unto them. So Joshua accompanied Moses as an assistant to him, even though there does come a point when he's going to be left behind as well. But the elders of Israel were left there with Aaron and Hur, essentially to look after Israel, as it were. And then beginning here with verse 15 down to the end of the chapter, Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai. And the cloud covered it 6 days. And the seventh day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud and got him up into the mount. And Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. So now we get this description of what Israel saw on the mountain during this time. Now, obviously, they didn't go up with Moses. They didn't go up with the others. They didn't go up and see God as some of the others did. And we're told that the mountain was covered. It's covered with a cloud, which indicates that it's sort of shrouded in a darkness, and it is also covered with a devouring fire, which we might describe as lightnings, or exactly what this looked like would be hard to say. But notice in this passage that twice we are told that it was the glory of Yahweh on the top of this mountain. Now, this word for glory, as you might have guessed from our study of the Psalms, it is the term kavod. And it does refer, the word itself refers to heaviness, to weightiness. And usually when used of a person, especially some person of importance, it would describe sort of their honor, their majesty, the splendor of their person and such. It is so oftentimes associated with ruling, with kingship in the Old Testament in particular. And here, this glory of Yahweh is a manifestation of God's presence. And typically, when spoken of God, it is also associated with light, with radiance, with dazzling and bright light. From the previous scene, then, again, they saw Christ in his kingdom glory, and so this is associated with his kingship. Moses was up on the mountain, we are told, for 40 days and 40 nights. And primarily there he was receiving instructions concerning the tabernacle. Now, once again, scenes like this are rare. We have a few, but they're very, very rare, which is part of the point. The writer of Hebrews referred to this scene at Sinai and the trembling of Israel, and even the trembling of Moses at the sight of God on Sinai. And again, we just can't help but think of that note, as this sight to Israel at the base of the mountain was terrifying. And we get that note that the elders saw God and they didn't die. He didn't reach out his hand, in other words, in judgment against them. Well, why would we need to know that? Why would we expect that they would die in God's presence? Well, because the Bible makes it very clear that we all, as human beings, are unholy, and we're unclean, and we are sinful. And time and again, we know that you can't appear before God without dying unless you have been sprinkled, unless you have been covered by the blood. See, we need cleansing. All this process that Israel went through before God even appeared on the mountain. Going back to chapter 19. We must be cleansed, and the blood of bulls and goats will not suffice. And that is a major point in the letter to the Hebrews. We need better blood, we need a better covenant, and we need a better mediator. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 23 to 28 then. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ is not entered into the holy place made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor yet that he should offer himself often, as the high priest entereth into the holy place every year with blood of others. For then must he have often suffered since the foundation of the world. But now, once in the end of the world, or in the end of the age, hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation. So we are building up as we're reading through. We are building up that expectation. Wait a minute. How can they come into the presence of, how can they see God? How can they come into the presence of God? How can they sit down and eat and drink before the Lord and he doesn't touch them? His hand does not strike them down. How can that happen? So again, we are building up this. We could refer to it as theology, whatever we want to call it. But we are building up what is being revealed to us about God, and even as we saw in the instructions already that God has given, that He is holy, and therefore He said to Israel, "You must be holy." And of course, again, we get this scene that reveals to us that it's only through the appropriate blood covering that you can appear before the Lord and not die. It's the only way, through the blood of Jesus Christ and through faith in His name. All right, we'll stop here and we will close with a hymn.